First step for preparing your plate for any intaglio is to get it trimmed down to the size that you want. So this is a giant piece of copper right here. So this would have to be cut before we start working on it. The second step is to then bevel that cut sheet of copper so that you have a piece that's the size that you want to work. So we've got a 9 by 12 there, and a little 6 by 9 piece of copper. And the reason you want to bevel it is that you can see with this piece, the machine edge from when it was cold rolled and then when we cut it is really abrupt, and sometimes it can be sharp and cut you. Also, as the plate goes in and out of the acid will eat into this flat edge and create what's called false biting. I've had plates that have been etched false bit so much that they became almost like serrated edges, and so when you're handling it, that then becomes dangerous to handle. The other problem with the plate that hasn't been beveled is that it's most likely to cut your paper and damage the felts when you're printing it. So there's two real reasons that you want to bevel your plate. One is to protect the felts in your paper when you're printing, and the other is that when it's going in and out of the acid, the ground that you're going to coat the plate with before you etch it is more likely to stick to an edge that's been beveled or angled to meet the top of the plate at less of an abrupt angle than what's there when it's cut, which is a 90-degree angle. So you want it to be about 45. And that has to do a little bit with like surface tension. When the ground, as the ground cools and dries, it contracts, and then it pulls away and it exposes this edge which causes you to get that false biting I was talking about, which can create a really dangerous sharp edge. It also creates an edge that prints a black line all the way around your image, which can be really distracting for a viewer. So yeah, let's jump into the beveling. To bevel, I'm going to want a file, 2 pieces of mat board, a couple clamps, some gloves to protect my hands, and a scraper and burnisher. All the tools you'll need for beveling your plate should be found in this green cupboard. Here in the top drawer, we have those scrapers and burnishers. In the next drawer down, we have clamps and files and a little bit of chipboard. All right, so I've got my plate, I got my tools for beveling, and one thing to point out really quick is that files really only work in one direction, and that's pushing. When you're holding the handle and you're pushing away from yourself. You can push up the plate to bevel, or you can push down the plate to bevel, but you want to make sure you're pushing. When you drag it back, you're not doing anything other than just kind of dulling the teeth a little bit and not really removing as much material in that direction. So to bevel, I want to go ahead and secure my plate. If I'm working really large, often the plate weighs enough that it's not going to shift around. I can kind of just rest a hand on it, and that's enough to hold it in place. But for small plates especially, it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's actually safer to clamp it down, which is why I want these pieces of chipboard. That's to protect my plate from the clamp, so it doesn't get all scratched and give me some extra work to do later. Because scratch marks, anything that dents or scratches the surface of the metal can later on hold ink and print. Sometimes artists will use that to their advantage. In undergrad, my professor and several of us would take our plates and actually kind of like skip them on the ground, down the sidewalk or whatever, so they would bounce, and you get these kind of cool, weird, interesting spiral scratches from the concrete and rocks and sand. Not always desirable, but if you're going for something like that, you can put the plate on the ground and literally like scuff it back and forth with your foot to get kind of random accidental scratch marks and stuff like that. But we're doing this in the traditional manner, which is to treat the surface like it's a pristine, valuable piece of metal. I want it clamped down, and then I want to file. So there's 2 motions. One is a downward motion, and the other is kind of away from my body. So I want to push down, but then also slide it along the edge. And that slide along the edge can be like 3 or 4 inches, or as many as 6 or 8 inches, just depending on how comfortable you are with the motion. So sometimes I'll even pull the file towards myself. I think this process is a lot faster if I'm standing and using a little bit of my body weight, my arms. I'm not pushing really hard, but if I'm sitting down, I just don't have as much of an angle to do the process. It just takes longer, I think. It's a lot slower. I want the file to be at about a 45-degree angle. A little bit more means the bevel will come onto your plate a little bit further, onto the surface of the plate, which is fine. And if I do it at a more abrupt angle, or more vertical, then I'll have less of a bevel, and I'll be more likely to get that false whiting on the edges. So 45 degrees doesn't need to be mathematically perfect, but just close. So I'm going to go ahead and finish beveling the angle on this with the file. And then I'll go ahead and do my other 3 edges. And I have found greater success with doing all the filing first, and then I'll shift to my burnisher and scraper and do those last. And what those will do is those will actually remove the teeth mark that are created by the file, and sort of polish and smooth that edge. Here's a close-up of those file marks created by the teeth on the file. You can see those will actually hold ink and print. Like I said, any scratch on the surface of the copper is a mark that will show up. And I want to make sure that bevel or that angle travels from the top of my copper to the bottom, that I don't have any machine cut edge left, which I think I'm pretty much there. So I'm going to go ahead and shift into time lapse, and I'll file the other 3 edges and come back and talk about the scraper and burnisher in just a minute. Alright, so I've gone ahead and put an angle on all 4 sides of my plate. And if we could go back in time and just imagine that I was wearing gloves for that, that's a lot safer to do with gloves, which I should have been wearing. But I was in kind of a rush, and so I didn't think about it until I got finished. But once I have the angle on there, I want to take my scraper. So the scraper has 3 sides. Sometimes I have a divot cut out of it like this one does. Sometimes it's a flat piece of metal there. I'm not sure exactly what the advantage of each is. I've heard different things about putting oil on the tool, and that way it rides or rests in that divot, so when you're scraping, it's kind of running down the tool and letting it slide across the surface a little bit more easily. But I haven't found that either one actually works faster or slower than the other, to be honest. But the way I want to use this for this application is I want to put my thumb on a flat side. So you can see it's resting on the flat side. And that means that the blade side is facing away from my thumb. And I want to rest that side on the plate and go back and forth with it. I find that it's much easier to pull towards myself, so I tend to stand, I'm right arm dominant, so this is my right hand. But I tend to stand on the left side of the plate and pull my right hand towards myself. Never with the point towards myself. It's got to stay kind of facing perpendicular to the motion that it's moving in. That way, if it slides off and comes towards myself, I'm not going to hit myself with the tip. Sorry about that, got a phone call. So What this is going to do is this is going to remove most of the sort of drag marks and scrape marks left by the file marks. But it's not going to create a surface that's, you know, polished or completely smooth. So I'm not going to be left with something completely smooth. That's why I want to finish off with the burnisher, which actually kind of polishes that surface. I want to make sure there's no metal sort of curved down on the bottom, so that's a good thing I'm wearing gloves, because if it was curved down and I had naked skin, I might cut myself just real thin like a paper cut. But I want to make sure it's not there. There's nothing there. But that is something that happens sometimes when you're scraping, is that the metal just gets really thin and kind of pushed down, and you just want to make sure that it's either beveled back up flat or scraped. All right, so the scraper I find works best if I go in one direction, kind of pulling towards myself. Burnisher, you can go either direction, at least in my experience. And again, you're kind of putting your thumb against one of the flat sides. I like to have the hook side up. I don't know if you guys can see that's got a slight hook. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're straight, but a lot of times they'll have a little bit of a, almost like a shoehorn kind of hook on there. And I want to have that facing up and my thumb against that flat side. And I'm basically just going to run this back and forth across the surface of the plate. Or surface, sorry, across that beveled edge. And when I'm doing that, I should see a more polished, kind of shiny, reflective surface left. Now I'll go ahead and unclamp this real quick. And I'll do the other three sides in a time lapse. You might see me use my hand instead of the clamps, because I've practiced doing that for years. But I wanted to try to get close real quick, close up with to the camera, and show you guys how shiny that looks. And it's smooth in comparison to that kind of rough edge made by the file. So again, smooth, get the right angle, and shiny, as opposed to that rough and scraped kind of surface that's made by the file. All right, so I'll switch you guys into into time lapse, and do the other three sides. All right, so I've got all four edges of my copper plate beveled now, so they're nice and smooth. They shouldn't be sharp enough to cut. You want to make sure, again, that angle is like about 45 degrees. If it's a little too horizontal, the file, when you're doing it, you can create a pretty sharp edge. But right now, that's safe to handle. Obviously, you know, you want to kind of feel around it a little bit gently before you start sliding your hand across it or anything like that. These plates are, you can see an example of what's called tarnishing or oxidization happening here on the plate. So these are examples of sort of like less tarnish, slightly more oxidation or tarnish. And then here's an old plate, and there's the back of the plate, which is about the same as this, but then once the plate's actually been etched, it will turn all kinds of blue and purples and greens and stuff that'll happen. And that's just copper reacting to oxygen and moisture in the air. It just happens over time. There's a really easy and quick way to take care of that. It's the same step that I need to use next to prepare the plate to actually put the hard ground on anyway. So I'm going to show you guys that in the next video.